Today in the EU, how Brexit's legacy limits Starmer's relationship with Europe. 5 years after the Brexit referendum, the UK has undergone its biggest change in a century. In Westminister, 5 prime ministers have tried and failed to stabilise the country's political and financial lifeline. Now, it's Starmer's turn. In Brussels, hopes rest on his success, especially in rekindling diplomatic ties on trade, defence and youth mobility. Where are we at in negotiations? And how is Brexit still influencing London's decisions? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Today I'm here in the studio with Owen Morgan, Euractiv's news editor. Hello, Owen, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Giada, thanks for having me.
So this week marked the 5-year anniversary of Brexit coming into effect. You're a Brit who's worked on the Brexit negotiations, and you're now working in the EU capital. Did you think that things would end up this way?
No, absolutely not. In 2016, I certainly didn't think this would be the path I'd take. I mean, I'm showing my age here, my relative youth, but the referendum in 2016 was my first vote.
Right.
It was my first vote, and I certainly didn't think then that I'd go on to work on the negotiations and build a career around Brexit, and especially not for the EU side. So no, I didn't see it coming, but I think that's the thing about Brexit that I'm guilty of forgetting. You know, now that things are a bit more settled and there seems to be more of a status quo in the relationship, I forget that Brexit caused this seismic realignment in British politics and arguably in British life, You know, it got people engaged in politics who hadn't previously voted, and it's those people's votes that are still sort of deciding our elections and have done ever since. And it unleashed also this kind of chaos and unpredictability into British life.
Indeed, the past 5 years have marked the beginning of unprecedented political instability. Tell us more about it.
The first British Prime Minister of my lifetime was Tony Blair, and he served for 10 years. Since Brexit, we've had, 5 leaders toppled, arguably by Brexit, including one who was competing with a lettuce for longevity, So I didn't see things panning out this way, but I think that's the point. Brexit made predicting things pretty tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of negotiations, Starmer met for the first time with the EU27 to talk about broad political objectives ahead of a summit this spring. What do we know about it, and how have these objectives shaped the rest of the negotiations so far?
So when we say broad political objectives, what we essentially mean in the context of Monday's meeting is 2 things. It means let's check in on how we're dealing with Trump and the threats of tariffs.
Yeah.
And let's talk about our defence cooperation. The summit was obviously defence-focused. Starmer was at NATO for most of the day, and then he went to join EU leaders for dinner. He's the first British Prime Minister to do so since Brexit, which obviously has some symbolic value. Not much is being revealed publicly at this stage. We know there's going to be another meeting in May. Starmer and von der Leyen have promised regular summits. It'll be interesting to see whether there's progress by May, but nothing major to come out of the summit on Monday.
What we know so far is that Starmer committed to spending $4.5 billion for Ukraine in a new aid package in January, and he hinted at a future EU-UK security pact expected to come out later this year. Do you think that defense is the way to Starmer's reset?
It's a good question, and this is the point that I've been grappling with this week in my conversations around Brussels. The defense and security pact, we know it's happening. We know it's very important to both sides, but the question is, how tied to the rest of the EU-UK relationship is it? In other words, how much of an impact on this so-called reset is it going to have? Mm-hmm. Brussels has historically made everything to do with Brexit interlinked, right? So concessions in one area might earn you something back in another.
For example?
So if we take the Windsor framework, the tinkering of the rules around Northern Ireland, that deal was done in 2022, and immediately afterwards, the EU let the UK back into Horizon, the EU's big research funding programme. So this has historically been the approach. I would be amazed if the talks on defence were, totally decoupled from the trade relationship. But equally, global events may well evolve, and, the potential dangers economically, even militarily, to Europe as a continent, they could escalate to the point where logic takes over and defence and security is seen as a priority, to the point where the EU and the UK just ram something through and they mend their bridges and they decouple it totally from the rest of the relationship and they stop this kind of little back and forth negotiation game. But the Commission obviously needs to get member states on board if it's going to do that. And
that's difficult, isn't it?
As we've seen this week already, member states have their own very specific asks and interest. And reconciling 27 is rarely easy.
And by the way, pragmatically speaking, collaborating on defense makes a lot of sense in terms of trade and financing. It would pump EU money into the UK's defence industrial base.
It would. And I think, for the UK, it's aware that the EU really does need its defence industry to be firing on all cylinders and selling cheaply to EU countries if the EU is going to do what it says it needs to do on defence. Our defence editor, Aurélie Pugnier, has written about this week. The UK's defence and aerospace sector is enormous. But I think if we're talking economically, and I think this is the great fallacy of Brexit, obviously the UK needs the EU more than the other way around, right? I mean, right. I'm sure our listeners are acutely aware that erecting non-tariff barriers to trade with your largest and closest trading partner is going to hurt, and it's going to hurt slowly and steadily, and that's what we've been seeing, on this 5-year anniversary of Brexit. At some point, I really believe, before the next election, if we're talking about UK politics, reality and the politics are going to collide and possibly engulf Starmer on this, and the economic reality that Brexit is damaging the UK economy, regardless of what kind of defence deal is done. That's going to have to be dealt with, and it's a conversation Keir Starmer's going to have to lead. He's inherited this economic mess.
But he's so far done very little about it.
He's running a government that talks about we are going to pursue growth at all costs, but the negative impact on growth of Brexit is becoming ever more clear by the day. Starmer's going to have to ward off the likes of Nigel Farage, who, if polls are going to be believed, is his main opponent right now. There was a poll that put Farage over Labour for the first time ever earlier this week. So, defence aside, the economic situation is dire and it's essentially a total mess. And I think 5 years on from Brexit, that's the legacy.
Yeah, that's the headline. 5 years on, UK is a mess. Goodbye.
Absolutely. It's an apt note to close on for sure.
And talking about conversations that Starmer has been reluctant to have, we should talk about free movement, right? One of the options for rapprochement between the EU and the UK. That's something that so far Starmer has not been willing to compromise on, but Brussels has been pushing for a youth mobility deal. Is that a non-negotiable for the EU, you think?
Yeah, from my conversations this week, it still feels like it's a red line for the EU, but it's a bit of a funny one because, we've been talking about, the economic impact of Brexit, and this is clearly more of a symbol than it is anything of, meaning economic value. A few tens of thousands of 18 to 30-year-olds spending a few years in either direction. We think it's going to be 4 years at the minute. That's hardly going to prevent a recession for either the EU or the UK.
So why is Brussels being so firm on this?
Well, the main reason that Brussels offered this deal in the first place was because the UK was sniffing around for bilateral deals with individual EU countries. And as ever, the adage in Brussels on Brexit has been, we need a united front with the 27 countries. And it's trying to keep that. For all the talk of the reset and the mood music and the fact that Starmer was here at all this week and what that might mean, it's clear the relationship isn't as hostile as it once was, but on substance, what is Keir Starmer doing differently to Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak? Starmer does not want to rip up the ECHR or, erase EU law from the UK statute book in one fell swoop. He respects his international obligations, but that doesn't mean that the EU is suddenly going to signal, I'm willing to make concessions on trade or on things like youth mobility, or we're going to move our red lines. I think the only way the trade relationship moves forward is if the UK blinks first. So from my conversations on both sides this week with Brits who were in town and with EU officials, there's a general feeling that this will be the first domino to fall on youth mobility because it's the only way to get things moving.
Thank you, Owen.
Thanks, Giada.
to understand the ongoing pace of trade relations between London and Brussels and how they might be impacted by tariffs incoming from the US, I'm talking to Joël Reland, an expert on Brexit and senior fellow at the think tank UK in a Changing Europe. Hello, Joël, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, the United Kingdom is in a kind of a tricky spot. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has signaled his welfare reset with the EU, yet he does not want any trouble with the United States either. We've seen it unfold with Trump's trade war. The United States president said the UK was out of line but would be spared, maybe, when the EU wouldn't.
UK is out of line, but I'm sure I think that one can be worked out. But the European Union it's an atrocity, what they've done. Well, Prime Minister Starmer has been very nice. We've had a couple of meetings. We've had numerous phone calls. We're getting along very well. And we'll see whether or not we can balance out our budget.
Is the UK trying to get the best of both worlds?
Yes, I think that's Keir Starmer's entire political operation, is not having to commit too strongly to one side or another. And that applies as much domestically as it does about international politics. But if you look at what he's doing with the European Union, it's about very small and moderate change because he doesn't want to disrupt the political picture at home. He doesn't want to be accused of trying to rejoin the EU via the back door by signing up to too many new agreements. Mm-hmm. And so those kind of small, limited changes leave quite a lot of space to be looking to do things with the United States at the same time because you're not attaching yourself very firmly and ideologically to the European bloc. But I think it's another question about how successful Starmer is going to be in his kind of courtship of the Trump presidency. Because if you look at the things that the US complains about Europeans not doing, it's not buying enough food from the United States. And that is still a really big problem in the UK as well. Like when you ask people whether they'd be happy to import, chlorinated chicken from the US, the answer is emphatically no. And that's really the key to any kind of US trade deal would be accepting all these agri-food products. So I really can't see something like that happening. I think if there is more progress between the UK and the US, it will also be quite small, quite technical, little deals on maybe digital services, AI, these kind of things where the UK doesn't have to follow the EU rulebook, but you don't have the same risks of importing low-quality goods which consumers don't want to be exposed to.
Mm-hmm. Especially because I think it's such an intrinsic part of European culture to not import agri-food from the US, right? With definitely different standards.
Yeah, and I think ideologically, Keir Starmer and his Labour Party are much more European than they are American. They're trying to play both sides because I think that's what they see as the geopolitically pragmatic thing to do. But if you look at their actions, they are much, much more European in instinct. So there's currently a piece of legislation going through the UK Parliament which would allow the UK to replicate lots of EU product safety regulations. And that's mainly to help businesses to maintain the same standards so you can work. Whether you're exporting to the UK or the EU, you have the same standards. But also, it's about making sure that the UK doesn't become what you call a dumping ground for substandard goods that the EU is saying it doesn't want any longer. For example, electric batteries on bicycles that sometimes have a tendency to explode, or toys that are unsafe for children. And just those kind of principles and those instincts are, European. They're about a strong state which protects its citizens and takes on a strong accountability for personal risk, which maybe you don't see to the same extent in the United States.
I want to focus on trade as a make or break point in Brexit negotiations. As you said, the Labour government wants to improve customs arrangement with the EU, and the EU remains one of the UK's top trading partners, which is what Starmer restated on Wednesday during question time in the Commons.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, I met other European leaders in Brussels to discuss vitally important focus on security and defence in a volatile world. I'm determined to reduce barriers to trade, making it easier for businesses to do business, and ensuring a better relationship with our European partners delivers for the British people.
The country ran £110,000 in trade deficit with the EU in 2023. So what would be a better arrangement for the country?
Okay, so we're going to depart from the red lines that the government has set itself, because anything else is just, you're dealing with fantasy. You could say rejoin the single market customs union, but the government has said, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Those are the things which would be of the biggest economic benefit to the UK. I think most economists would say leaving those two institutions has cost the UK maybe 2 or 3% of the size of its economy. It would be 2 to 3% bigger had we remained in them. But it's not on the table. So really what you're left doing is looking for, tinkering around the edges of the deal, and you're not going to create dramatic economic growth. But what you might do is help some sectors that are particularly struggling.
And what are you referring to here?
Agri-foods is the main one. If there was one other that I'd point to, it would be the question of linking emissions trading systems, which sounds very, very technical.
Interesting.
Yeah. But what's that? I mean, I won't go into the full intricacies of emissions trading, but...
Oh, we do cover it on the podcast quite a bit. Don't worry, our listeners are accustomed to it.
Well, I'm sure then they're experts and I don't need to give them the details of how you do it. But the result is, if they were to do that, and the key thing is the TCA, the trade agreement the UK and the EU have, says that you can do this, you can link your schemes. And what that would mean is that the UK would be exempted from the EU CBAM, which comes into effect next year.
Yeah.
And that is another potentially very big trade friction, which is going to be added to the relationship, which means that a UK exporter of steel or cement or fertilizer is going to be hit with new tariffs when they're exporting to the EU market. And they also have to complete new paperwork to show how much embedded carbon there is in their goods. It would hit electricity trading very hard as well, which would also have consequences for EU consumers.
And cutting red tape is something that we hear quite a lot about in Brussels lately. That's ideologically a line that's held by conservative governments. However, we see the Labour Party is now a staunch defender of it. Do you think that the main solution to improving trade cooperations with Brussels at the end of the day is getting rid of bureaucracy?
This isn't so much red tape as it's a process which has been created, I guess, because the two systems aren't aligned. The UK hasn't created a regulation saying you must now have your goods checked at the border. The EU hasn't created that regulation. It's just a natural product of having divergent systems, not being part of the same sector. So it's not really about cutting regulations. But interestingly, this Labour government is now talking a lot about doing that as well. So trying to get rid of regulations in certain sectors, for example, financial services or competitions and markets policy, in order to encourage innovation, they say. And that's quite odd to hear them talk about it, because they sound quite a lot like Boris Johnson's government when they do that. That was the big promise of Brexit, was cutting, too much Brussels red tape. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to be dynamic. We're going to be innovative. We're going to turbocharge and be world-beating, all these kind of boosterish language. And Labour's now borrowing it, which isn't necessarily what I would have expected. But I also think the Johnson government provides lessons on why this isn't necessarily going to bring the benefits that they think it is. Because Johnson's government, this was a big agenda, but they basically delivered no regulatory reform to speak of. And the reason barely anything has happened is that business doesn't like it. Because if your regulations are different to the EU's, trade generally becomes harder, which comes back to that point about having the different agri-food systems. So the UK could, for example, reform its medical devices regulation, which was something they thought about, and say, our system is going to be simpler, easier to navigate for business, great, encourage innovation, growth, blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, if you're an international business, the UK system is different to the EU system. So you have to comply with two regimes rather than one. It's still more work overall.
Yeah.
And which system are you going to prioritise? The EU, because it's a market of 15-20% of global healthcare spending. The UK is 1 or 2%.
And especially now, with the threat of tariffs looming over the country, there might be more pressure to facilitate trade as soon as possible in any way that's feasible. How do you see the situation going forward? And I know that everybody I've asked this question to has hated me so far because there's many moving pieces. But what's your take?
It's going to be baby steps, I think. It will be nothing dramatic, and probably it will be making one agreement and then maybe looking in a couple of years to do something a little bit more ambitious. So if you look at what the Labour government is talking about at the moment, you have this veterinary deal. They've now started talking about emissions trading and potentially also joining this Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention, which is something to kind of help with customs processes around trade. And so I think broadly speaking, the question is, how many of those things are they going to focus on to begin with, and are they going to do them all together? That's what we don't really know yet. And I think that's why this summit, which has just been announced, they've given the date for the 19th of May, I think is when we'll have more clarity on exactly which of those policies they are going to start negotiations on, and also whether they do them all together as a package deal, which tends to be the EU's preferred way of working. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, because that gives them more control over all the different moving parts. Or do you do lots of little individual bits differently? So that I think is when we'll see a little bit more. But whatever the result, it's going to be just a handful of measures that might slightly help trade, might slightly help a few sectors, but it's not going to do anything really, really significant. And we're going to see most businesses complaining about the same things they've been complaining about ever since Brexit happened.
It's time to resize expectations then.
Yeah, and I think most businesses on the UK side are increasingly aware of that. And so I think in some senses that actually contributes to this culture of focusing on very specific problems. Like, for example, we also talk a lot about problems that musicians face when they're touring in the EU. It wouldn't be in the top 20 list of things that I would focus on analytically in terms of really helping trade, but the music lobby has a big voice and they've got that on the agenda, and government has listened and it went in the manifesto. So it's kind of which business can shout loudest enough to get their problems dealt with, I think will have a big bearing on what the UK ends up doing.
As always, we'll be here for that. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.